There are two cases I want to start with because they both have to do with the separation between church and state, which seems to be, quickly becoming a relic from a bygone era. Let's start. I don't know. We might do them chronologically. Let's start with Carson v. Makin. This is a case out of Maine. Tell us about this.
So this case involves a unique feature of Maine's education system, but there is nothing about the holding that limits it to Maine. So Maine is a pretty big state with lots of rural areas where the state cannot afford to build or run public schools. So in those regions, it instead gives money to families to spend at private schools that the state intends to function as substitutes for public schools. So it has these requirements that private schools have certain curricula to receive this money, that they have to teach these subjects, and that they cannot be overtly religious. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be affiliated with religion. Lutherans can set up a school and it can be formally affiliated with Lutheranism, but the actual curriculum has to be secular because, again, these are supposed to be stand-ins for public education in places where it's just not possible. And in Carson, the Supreme Court struck down the requirement under state law that schools must be secular in order to receive this money, and said that it is a discrimination in violation of the First Amendment's free exercise clause for Maine to attempt to preserve the separation of church and state by refusing to spend taxpayer dollars sending children to overtly religious private schools that do not just educate them, but indoctrinate them with explicit Christian values.
And would also, those schools could also theoretically, and very often do, we're not going to have gay teachers. We're not going to, it would be a bit of a throwback, but we're also only going to have white teachers. We're not going to, there could be a whole host of things that their, religious doctrines, would be discriminatory based upon any other sort of, any other, context.
Yes, and also these schools that are now set to receive money also discriminate against religious minorities. So they teach students, for instance, that Islam is an evil and untrue religion that violates the tenets of Christianity. They do not accept Jewish kids. They do not accept Hindu kids. They discriminate against the children of same-sex couples, even if those kids are straight. They are, in all the ways that are possible, extremely discriminatory and bigoted, frankly, against the very public that they are supposed to be serving by standing in for Maine's public education system.
Does it also inhibit the ability of Maine to set specific standards in terms of what they're taught? Because, I know, just for an example, there are yeshivas in parts of Brooklyn, religious schools where, they're not necessarily taught a lot of things that you need in terms of math and science. I imagine there are also some Christian fundamental schools. There could be other, I'm not familiar necessarily with Muslim fundamental schools where creationism has as much time on the curriculum, if not more, than the idea of like biology or, other sciences. Where does the imposition, can Maine still maintain certain curriculum requirements?
So I think that's the right question to ask, along with whether Maine can even require secular teaching in public schools. And, the answer is whatever 5 justices want it to be. I think the logical implication of this decision is that the answer is no, because the court essentially holds that states do not have a compelling or important or even legitimate interest in maintaining secular systems of public education. The court equates secularism with anti-religious discrimination. discrimination, and says that under the free exercise clause, it is discriminatory for states to mandate that schools be teaching only civic education or secular education, and that to gag schools from teaching religious education is, again, unconstitutional. Now, the holding in this case only applies to private schools. And so I think in your example, the answer would be that New York cannot force yeshivas to teach secular education, that states cannot require private schools to maintain certain curricula that adhere to basic standards. And then the next question becomes, well, what about in public schools? And this touches on the next case we'll discuss, but can a state say you're not allowed to indoctrinate students with religion? You're not allowed to express overt religious ideology in the classroom? Again, I think the answer under this decision is no. And the real question is, how far are Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts willing to go in eroding the secular foundations of our public school system?
And just to clarify, what I meant by with Maine is that you don't get these funds. You're not eligible for these funds, because this is a function of Maine having this unique or supposedly unique dynamic where they subcontract to private schools public school education because they don't have the facilities there. But they do have requirements as to what those private schools must teach in terms of curriculum, because, to be eligible for that funds. Can they impose that same standards on religious schools? Or would that be problematic?
I think it would clearly be problematic under this ruling. Again,
okay.
I think the only way a state can impose those standards is if it has a strong interest in doing so. That the state needs to be able to articulate some kind of reason why it is imposing these curricula standards. And the decision in Carson says that secularism is off the table, that, say, teaching real science rather than creationism is presumably off the table as a strong state interest, because, again, the court deems that to be discriminatory against religion. So, every state does this a little differently, but the upshot of Carson is that courts are going to assume that any kind of secular requirements are unconstitutional unless the Supreme Court says otherwise.
Okay, so I have one other question. So Maine does this thing where they subcontract it out. But doesn't, ostensibly that's somewhat unique because it's such a rural state.
Right.
But my understanding is, or I have specific knowledge of this, that if I have a student in a public school that has a specific learning challenge, and the public school, I can show that the public school does not have the sufficient resources to teach my child because of their challenges, the school system is obligated to fund my child attending a special school. Maybe they're severely dyslexic. I don't, without getting into the specifics of but maybe that's the dynamic. Does Carson then hold in that situation where it's not a regular feature of where I'm subcontracting entire school districts to private schools, and therefore can't discriminate between, religious and secular schools. But in this instance, does that then open up some, a yeshiva, for instance, to say, like, we get funding too, because you're giving funding to that school that helps kids with certain other learning challenges. The public school's doing that, and so we get it too.
Absolutely. I have no doubt that under those circumstances, if a religious school were excluded from that program and they tried to gain access by filing a lawsuit, that this Supreme Court would side with them, and that if the lower courts felt differently, that this Supreme Court would step in. Because, again, this Supreme Court has established a rule that discrimination against schools on the basis of religion is impermissible, despite the Establishment Clause, which basically doesn't exist anymore. anymore, according to this court. And that, if there is any kind of program that is taking kids out of the mainstream public school system, out of the schools that are actually run directly by the government for most kids, and putting them in any kind of alternate program, whether it's through this weird Maine system or through vouchers or tax credits or scholarships, that religious schools have to be able to compete for those students and accept those students. And anything less is a violation of free exercise. So I think that is, again, the right question to be asking. And in that circumstance, I am certain that a majority of this court would say, yes, the yeshiva has to be able to absorb the students with learning disabilities, even if they aren't going to be providing them with the education that they deserve and would get in a secular alternative program.
Two questions. One, is this going to be an easy conduit for the Supreme Court to target sex education potentially in schools under religious free exercise claims? And secondly, do you perceive them in the way that Thomas does, which is just throwing out these, hey, Republican state legislatures, go after this in this particular area, going after the precedent? Was it Edwards v. I'm blanking on the last part of that. Said teaching creationism in schools is unconstitutional from the 80s. Would that be a way for them to more explicitly go after that that as well?
If you combine Carson with Kennedy v. Bremerton, the other case we'll discuss, then I think you have a clear roadmap for red states to not only roll back things like sex education, but to restore things like creationism, intelligent design, and other overtly religious topics in school. Because, here we have the court saying that secular education, not actually a state interest. States don't have any kind of historical, compelling constitutional reason to insist that its education system remains secular. And then if you look at Kennedy, which we'll talk about soon, the court basically says that schools are free to inject religion into their day-to-day operations, that school officials are free to engage in religious exercise. And unless they literally force students to join them, unless they tell students, you must pray with me, then they are not violating the Establishment Clause. And under that test, I think creationism would absolutely pass.
All right, let's move to Kennedy. This is the case coming out of Washington State, where you had a football coach who, after each game, would go out into the center of the field and start to pray. And depending on whether you want to believe your lying eyes or whether you want to believe Neil Gorsuch, there's some dispute there. But before we get to I don't know if it's best to start with a factual dispute. Because let's start with the legal dispute here. Why don't we just start with what is the Lemon test, as it was called?
So the Lemon test, as it's applied by the court up until yesterday, asks whether some kind of government law or action creates the sense to a reasonable observer that there is an endorsement of religion. So if you are a reasonable person and you see some law or some government action and you think that that's either endorsing a particular faith, a particular sect, or endorsing religion over non-religion, then that violates the Establishment Clause, because the fundamental rule of the Establishment Clause has to be government neutrality toward religion and toward religion or non-religion. The government cannot be seen as creating insiders, in-groups who share this official religion that's endorsed by the state, and out-groups of people who are sort of left out in the cold and not a full part of the political community because they don't share the majority religion. That was the Lemon test as applied by the court. That was the rule until this week when the Supreme Court overturned it in the Kennedy case. There
are three aspects of the Lemon test, right? I mean, the way that you assess it.
Yeah, so there are, but really over the last 20 years, the court has boiled them down into this question of endorsement, because the Lemon test the purpose was the whole idea of the lemon test was we want to look at the purpose of laws. We want to look at the effect of laws. We want to look at how entanglement can happen between church and state if these laws are passed. And I think the court did a very good job in more recent cases. Sandra Day O'Connor, this was sort of her mission, to boil that down into a more coherent test that just looks at the question of endorsement. Does it look like a law is endorsing religion? Is the purpose of a law to endorse religion? Is this endorsement going to send a message that there are in-groups and out-groups?
Now, and so in this instance, it does it turn on the facts? Like, I mean, here's the thing that I find confusing about this, because generally the facts of the case are largely, it seems to me, rarely in dispute by the time you get to the Supreme Court. I mean, the whole point is not that the facts are settled. And then we just make a determination as to what the law says in this instance. I mean, it's or maybe how the law even applies to these facts. But this feels like it turns on the facts in a way that is it's very odd, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's odd in the sense that the facts are fundamentally contested, and that, as Justice Sotomayor illustrated in her dissent, one side is telling the truth and one side is lying, because we have photographic evidence of what actually happened here. And the whole case seemed to turn on this question of, if you look at the photographic evidence, is there endorsement of religion? And if you look at the pictures, there is a coach holding his helmet up high in a prayer circle with a bunch of students in the middle of a field, wearing his uniform, smack dab in the middle of his official duties, expressing thanks to a Christian God.
Let's see. We have pictures of it. So let's put these pictures up. Here is one. Where is the others? I mean, there's the picture of the helmet
in
going
the
up
back
there
with the helmet. Yeah. So if you're sitting in the stands there and you're listening to this guy give thanks to his Christian God, a public school employee in the middle of a football field surrounded by teammates, to me, I think I'm a pretty reasonable observer. That looks like an endorsement of Christianity. And I don't think it's really possible to interpret it as anything else.
Well, I mean, what seems to be even more dramatic is if I'm on that team and I want to play.
Yeah. I
mean, short of me being, the star quarterback, if I'm standing where the person who took that photo is, I'm afraid to show up at practice the next day.
You wouldn't even get to be the star quarterback if that was the guy, right? Like those high school coaches behave like judge, jury, and executioner, and they revel in the power that they get, and he revels in the power that he gets of getting his whole team to do this.
I love that psychological insight, Emma, and I think it's spot on. And I mean, honestly, to this case, yes. Because this is the other thing. We're talking about endorsement. There's this even deeper test that it's sort of like the ultimate establishment clause test, which is, are state actors, state officials, here the coach, coercing individuals into participating in a religious exercise that they don't support? Is it coercion of religion? That is what James Madison said. The number one thing government can't do is coerce religious exercise. And here it is so obvious that the coach is coercing religious exercise by sending this message to his players: if you do not join me in the prayer circle, you will not be part of the in-group. You will not be getting equal playing time. You will not be favored by me. And in case there were any doubt about this, students submitted testimony that they were ostracized when they refused to participate initially, and only joined and kneeled and prayed because they felt that they were being mistreated by the coach and other school officials by refusing to participate. And again, that is the gravest sin under the Establishment Clause that courts had ever identified.
So where does this? I mean, this feels like it. This, because it was always like a prayer in school, right? I mean, when we articulated, this was always sort of the bedrock of the way that I would explain to young children as to what does it mean to separate church and state. Where does this leave us? I mean, when we have all the RFRA stuff that we're anticipating, right? When we have, I don't know what cases we're going to hear next year. You have a better sense of that, but we're not far from a whole host of things that people don't have to participate in ostensibly because of religion. Like, we're expanding what constitutes an infringement upon people in terms of based upon their religion.
Yes. And where I think this leaves us is with almost no constitutional bar against school prayer, because what the court did in this case is hold that Coach Kennedy was in fact protected by the free speech and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment to engage in Christian prayer during the course of his duties at this moment on the field. And what that means is that schools now have a kind of blueprint for restoring Christian prayer. What they can do is say, well, look, we're not officially sponsoring this prayer, but individual teachers are free to engage in whatever religious expression they prefer during the course of their duties, because otherwise we would be violating the First Amendment and violating their rights. And so teachers can now engage in prayer in the classroom, subtly or not so subtly coerce students into joining them. And unless they tell students, you will be expelled if you don't pray to Jesus, there's basically nothing those kids or their parents can do about it.
Yeah, seems bad.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about the facts and how the majority lied about them?
Yeah, I mean, that is, but does there, okay, let's talk about that, because it seems like if you lie about the facts, it is restricting the breadth of your ruling, right? Like, I mean, if I'm saying that if in Gorsuch world, this is just a coach who quietly moved to the side and right after the game, turned his back on everybody and, got down and kneeled and did whatever he did and prayed to God quietly. It's almost like nobody even realized he was doing it, except for, one, finger wagger, busybody in the corner said, "Oh, I could tell he's praying." That's the way Gorsuch made it sound like it was happening. It's clearly not. We have the pictures. But doesn't that restrict the scope of his ruling?
So it would be nice to think so. And I certainly think that you could make an argument to that effect. And you just did very, very persuasively. Let me give you the other side of it. The other side of it is that until this decision, the court had said that when you're looking at violations of separation of church and state, you have to take the entire context into account. You can't just look at the one or two instances where the person was nailed for allegedly violating the law. You have to look at their behavior before then, the behavior leading up to the violation, because that is what gives the broader sense of an endorsement of religion. Not just these 3 games where the school district formally reprimanded him, but also, according to Sotomayor, the 50 games before that where the school district didn't know what was going on. And so Gorsuch rejects that, and he just zeroes in on these 3 games where, according to him, the school district took like official action. And so you could argue that that restricts the scope. But what Sotomayor says, and I think this is very compelling, is that is giving violators of the Establishment Clause an easy out, where they can violate the Establishment Clause willy-nilly up until they're figured out. And then once they're identified, once the school realizes what they're doing, then they can kind of go get much narrower, get much subtler about their violations. And if they're punished, they can say, well, I wasn't punished for when I was preaching the gospel of Jesus for 3 years in the classroom. I was only punished for that one day where I had a Bible on my desk and was quietly reading verses to myself. And so I think that by narrowing the realm of violations that courts can actually assess, Gorsuch is making it much, much harder for school districts and other government officials to tamp down on Establishment Clause violations by creating this artificial narrowness of the inquiry.
And they also lied as to whether he was fired.
Right. He was
It
not
just
fired.
seems bizarre.
He was just canceled.
So,
right?
yeah, he was a victim of cancel culture. So Gorsuch words this very carefully. He doesn't use the word fired, but he says that the coach lost his job because he was praying, which is basically the same thing and is not at all true. What happened was that the coach was on a year-to-year contract. After he violated the district's rules, he was placed on paid administrative leave. And at the end of his year-long contract, he personally declined to apply for a renewal and then moved to Florida. So he was not in any sense of the word fired.
Okay. Well, it just seems bizarre. Like, have you, I mean, because this isn't like a complicated, like, I can see how, like, well, you've got the facts wrong. The sequencing of this very complicated, machinations of this, whatever, I don't know, this corporate merger is incorrect. And therefore your holding is this seems to be pretty straightforward stuff. I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand the difference between he got fired, he got suspended. What's going on with this?
I think that the Supreme Court majority today is in a rush. It really wants to check off a bunch of items on its agenda and is in as short a time as possible, because some of those justices still remember when Scalia died, they had all of these big opinions that they had to toss in a drawer and hold off for 2 to 4 years because they lost their 5th vote. And they don't want that to happen now. And I think what Gorsuch and his friends realized was, look, we're not necessarily going to have the votes when the next big school prayer case arises. So even though the facts of this case are not aligned with what we want, where we want to go, even though we have to manipulate the facts to reach the conclusion we want to reach, we can just do it. We've got the votes. We've got the majority. So let's just rewrite the record, just blow past all of these falsehoods that the lawyers below gave us, pretend like this is what actually happened, and then use that new narrative to build law that we like. That's my best explanation for what went on in this case.
All right, let me ask you just one last thing that's a sort of a broader general question. And that is, it feels like the Lemon test is one of a couple of, like, I don't know, principles that the court is in the process of jettisoning, that they are. And you gave us a preview of what we can expect with the EPA test tomorrow, that being the West Virginia, the major questions doctrine. But it feels like the court is sort of like shedding itself. In shedding the precedents, they also need to shed the sort of the tools that have established these precedents. Does that make sense, what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the court overrules the Lemon test in this case. Gorsuch actually claims that it was already overruled at some point, which is not true. And I think that what's important to remember is that these tests arose because the court felt that it needed to provide a set of rules that everyone could play by, so that everyone was working from the same playbook, and that even if they disagreed about how a particular rule applied in this case, everybody was on the same page about the ground rules. And this court does not want to have those rules constraining its exercise of power. This court does not want to have to run through these tests and doctrines and rules in order to reach its conclusion. It just wants to do whatever it wants as quickly as possible. And this is a theme not just in this Kennedy case, but also in the abortion case, where it tosses out the undue burden standard, in the guns case, where it tosses out this two-step framework that all of the lower courts have been using for ages. And it just says, we're making up the rules as we go along, and the lower courts will have to catch up. And that really jettisons one of the only real constraints on the Supreme Court's power, and gives it a newfound ability to just push off in whatever direction it wants without even having to bother to explain itself.
And it also feels like it's basically saying, look, Fifth Circuit, Eighth Circuit, you guys, we were all sat in the same conference rooms, talking, at the Federalist Society meetings. We know what our positions are on this. I mean, this is sort of like, it is there. You don't need to apply some type of litmus test to assess these things. We already know where we want to go.
Yeah.
And you already know where we want to go. I mean, this is sort of like, it feels like it's turning the court system into the same dynamic that I feel like is modeled, like I see in right-wing talk radio, essentially, or that whole right-wing messaging thing. There's one or two people at the top. You'd follow Limbaugh, or maybe you'd follow Hannity, and everything else, all the local radio stations would just basically crib the regional guy would just crib from basically their talking points, and that's it. We don't need you don't need to. There's no mechanism. There's no machine. We don't have to put it through some function to figure out what it is. Inputs are irrelevant. You just tell us the outputs that you want, and that's it.
Yes, but I would just add that the court is also winking to these judges in the lower courts that they should try to push these decisions as far as possible, that they should take these doctrines, these newfound legal principles, to their logical extreme, because that allows the Supreme Court to do this work much faster. It really speeds up the pace of this revolution, because the Fifth Circuit is constantly churning out new and ever more radical cases that ask the Supreme Court to push the envelope as far as it'll go.
We're going to have to catch up with you next week. Obviously, the EPA thing is happening. I want to talk about what happened with Louisiana. The court essentially basically chucked, I don't know how they can eviscerate the Voting Rights Act more, but they seem to figure out a new way of doing it almost every case that shows up there. We'll also want to talk about the tribal sovereignty, but we're going to have to do this next week, and I got a lot of time to digest this court session, which is, I feel, I mean, even before tomorrow, has shaped up to be the most radical shift in American jurisprudence. It feels like you tell me. I think that it's the most radical so far, but at the same time, this majority is just getting started, and it has so much else in store for us.
Oh, lovely.
Mark Joseph Stern, I guess. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Prophet of Doom.
Appreciate you coming on today.